On Azure DevOps there is Azure Boards, Azure Work Items, Azure Backlogs, Azure Sprints, Azure Queries, Azure Delivery Plans, Azure Repo, Azure Pipelines, Azure Test Plans, Azure Artifacts. On Azure Portal, learn CLI basics with quick starts and tutorials. To learn how to use the Azure CLI, try an in-depth tutorial for setting up virtual machines and using the power of the CLI to query Azure resources. There are also quick starts for other popular services. Create a storage account using the Azure CLI. Transfer objects to / from Azure Blob Storage using the CLI. Create a single Azure SQL database using the Azure CLI. Create an Azure database for MySQL Server using the Azure CLI. Create an Azure database for PostgreSQL using the Azure CLI. Create a Python web app in Azure. Run a custom Docker Hub image in Azure Web Apps for containers. Azure Command Line All Docs. Quick Start. Deploy a container instance in Azure using the Docker CLI. Create Azure Context. Create a container. Pull the container logs. Clean up resources. Tutorial. Deploy a multi-container group using Docker Compose. Prerequisites. Create Azure Container Registry. Log into Container Registry. Get application code. Modify Docker Compose file. Run multi-container application locally. Push image to container registry. Create Azure Context. Deploy application to Azure container instances. Next steps. Quick Start. Build and run a container image using Azure Container Registry tasks. Prerequisites. Create a resource group. Create a container registry. Build and push image from a Docker file. Run the image. Clean up resources. Next steps. Quick Start. Deploy a container instance in Azure using the Azure CLI. Prerequisites. Create a resource group. Create a container. Pull the container logs. Attach output streams. Clean up resources. Next steps. Quick Start. Deploy an Azure Kubernetes Service cluster using the Azure CLI. Prerequisites. Create a resource group. Create AKS cluster. Connect to the cluster. Deploy the application. Test the application. Delete the cluster. Next steps. Create a Linux virtual machines in Azure using Ansible. This article presents a sample Ansible playbook for configuring a Linux virtual machine. In this article, you learn how to create a resource group, create a virtual network, create a public IP address, create a network security group, create a virtual network interface card, create a virtual machine, create an ingress controller in Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. Before you begin basic configuration, customized configuration, check the load balancer service, run demo applications, create an ingress route, test the ingress controller, clean up resources. Next steps. Installing Helm docs. Install existing applications with Helm in Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. Before you begin, verify your version of Helm. Install an application with Helm v3. Import the images used by the Helm chart into your ACR. Next steps. Quick Start. Create an Azure database for MySQL Server using Azure CLI. Prerequisites. Create an Azure database for MySQL Server. Configure a server-level firewall rule. Get the connection information. Connect to Azure database for MySQL Server using MySQL command line client. Clean up resources. Next steps. Quick Start. Create a single database, Azure SQL database. Quick Start. Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB driver for Node.js. Prerequisites. Setting up object model code examples. Run the code. Clean up resources. Next steps.